We are back with your most important NASCAR betting stop of the day. This is the Money Stop, presented by Kicking the Tires. He is Cole Cusumano. I'm Steven Cusumano. Together, we are the Cusumano brothers, and we are here to help you win some money. Cole, straight into it, splash and go on the most important stop of the day. First ever race in the Cup Series at Iowa, and leave it to Ryan Blaney with about 80 friends and family members in attendance. Heads to victory lane. This was a really, I thought it was a pretty good race. I mean, it looked like in the early going, Kyle Larson was definitely the dominant car, but obviously ran into some trouble. I think that for the most part, we did a pretty good job forecasting this race, considering the amount of unknowns that there were. But I don't know. What were your thoughts on this race? I feel like I was pretty pleased with this first race at Iowa.
No, I agree on all fronts, actually. I enjoyed this race a lot. I think it was by far and away the best race that we've seen on a short track in the next-gen car, most likely. I mean, I guess I'd put this up there kind of with Bristol from this year, but that was also kind of a crapshoot. You look at how this race played out from the beginning of the week until the main event. In practice and qualifying, these drivers were blowing tires after like 20, 25 laps into a run, which was in line with what we saw at Bristol. But come the race, I think what you saw was it was ran later in the day into the night, so the track temp was a bit lower. Teams were able to adjust the cars, manage the tires throughout the day, and it just made for a great race. I mean, like I said during Bristol, I think it's a great thing, especially with this current car, when you can have those tire management races. Just adds another element of strategy, and it makes it more intriguing to watch, more compelling to watch at home, and that's exactly what we got. And yeah, Ryan Blaney finally back in victory lane. Team Penske's finally back, I think we could say. They've won 2 of the last 3 races. Ford as a whole is back on the map after being winless through the first 12 races. They've won 3 of the last 5. So I think as we go through these episodes here on the Money Stop, you're going to see these Fords play more of a factor in the favorites and the sleepers, as opposed to just the values like we've been seeing for a majority of the year. But yeah, I was very impressed with the race overall at Iowa. Really excited to see where this work goes from here in reference to Iowa. And I'm really pumped up for this week at Loudon, because I think historically we've had a lot of success on the short tracks doing this show. And going through making this outline the last couple days, this is an excellent show that we have lined up. And I think we're going to be definitely putting some money in your pocket.
Yeah, I mean, just to tie up Iowa real quick, I thought that the technical aspect of it, the strategy aspect of the race, made it really enjoyable, like you said, and I'm excited to go there again next year. But like you said, going to New Hampshire this week, I think this, like you said, will play into our wheelhouse based on what we've excelled with on this podcast over the past couple of years, because there is, contrastly to Iowa, a good amount of predictability. So before we run into that, let's run down these results from Iowa, beginning with Ryan Blaney. The runner-up was William Byron, who did come pretty close to running Blaney down. Chase Elliott was 3rd, Christopher Bell in 4th, Ricky Stenhouse Jr. in 5th, was one of our value picks. We talked about the possibility of dropping a top 5 prop bet or a top 10 prop bet for Ricky Stenhouse Jr., and he wound up factoring into the top 5 of this race. Joey Logano finished 6th. It was Josh Berry 7th, who had a really strong day, Alex Bowman 8th, Daniel Suarez 9th, and then you mentioned Brad Keselowski, another Ford in the top 10. So, Cole, let's talk about New Hampshire, the Magic Mile. We're going to get the starting lineup, 1:20 Eastern Time, and as we take it to the bank and look at the pre-qualifying odds per DraftKings, it's going to be a who's who largely of Joe Gibbs Racing Toyotas. That starts with Christopher Bell, who is the odds-on favorite this week per Vegas at plus 450. You got Martin Truex Jr. at plus 500. Kyle Larson rings in at plus 600, in fact tied at the 3rd best odds with Denny Hamlin. And then last week's winner, Ryan Blaney, is plus 700, now officially back in the playoffs. So as we look at some favorites here, Cole, I think that it's kind of like we talked about with Iowa last week. I think we kind of thought that the Toyotas would be the strong cars. It wasn't necessarily the case a week ago, but I think that as we look at the favorites this week, I do anticipate that definitely being the case at New Hampshire.
Without a doubt. And that was another weird thing about Iowa, was that we really thought those Joe Gibbs Racing Toyotas were going to be factors. And really, outside of like Christopher Bell, who rebounded for a top 10 finish, Denny Hamlin was a non-factor. He got caught up in a wreck with Kyle Larson. MTJ was also a non-factor. But I think looking at New Hampshire, there is no doubt in my mind that a Toyota is going to end up in victory lane. They've gone to victory lane, both races of the next-gen car. And if you're looking at the props for a Toyota to win the race, they're actually at even right now at plus 100. So that could be a big money bet to start you off here at this episode. But I'm going to kick things off here with our favorites for this week, beginning with the odds-on favorite in Christopher Bell, who is again plus 450 for the race win and the most expensive driver for DFS at $11,000. He is now riding a 4-race top 10 streak with another top 5 finish at Iowa. And we noted last week he's been one of the best on the short tracks in 2024. But what we really want to hit on here is the tracks similar to Loudon, the Richmonds, the Phoenixes, because, I mean, we've been to, 6 short tracks this year, and there's just so much, diversity in those short tracks. You got concrete tracks, you got half miles, miles, it's pretty crazy to think of the complexion of the circuit overall in the Cup Series, but especially between the short tracks. So hitting on those tracks like Loudon, he got the win at Phoenix earlier this year. He had a pretty strong run at Richmond, and keep in mind, he won the first next-gen race at Loudon. Did finish 29th last year, but he did start from the pole, so he has had speed here no matter what. Also had the runner-up back in 2021, but also wanted to take note here, he's a perfect 3-0 in the Xfinity Series at New Hampshire, with a chance to continue that streak with a run this weekend in the Xfinity Series. So I think you look at Christopher Bell's stats at Loudon, it's a no-brainer to have him as a favorite and as someone as a potential lock for your lineup and prop bets this week. And if you were considering Christopher Bell for race winner pick for the Xfinity Series once again, he's actually plus 110 in BetMGM, but if you were to go to other draft sites like FanDuel or DraftKings, he's actually under even to finish as the winner. He's minus 110. So he is a heavy favorite in the Xfinity Series. He's a favorite in the Cup Series for a reason, and I think he's going to be one of our top contenders for sure. But the driver I have my eye on is going to be Martin Truex Jr., who is the second shortest odds to win at plus 500, and then $10,500 for DFS, which is the third most expensive, and who I think could be the best value in the favorites category. But there is some maybe caution to kind of throw in with MTJ, considering he is riding a 5-race drought since his last top 10 finish. That's not to say, though, that he hasn't had speed, because he had the engine failure at Gateway, where he was running top 10. He ran out of gas in the final turn at Sonoma, running second. But with that in mind, he dropped to 5th in the standings after holding second for 7 straight weeks. So I know it looks bad on paper for MTJ, but the speed has still definitely very much been there. And we look at Loudon, he finally got his maiden win last year at one of his few home tracks, being a Jersey native. And he has the most laps led in the series with over 1,100. Of those 1,100, he actually has led 426 in those 2 next-gen starts. I mentioned Christopher Bell leading the second most. That's basically a 400-lap differential there between MTJ and Bell. So he has been flat-out dominant at Loudon in the next-gen era, finishing 1st and 4th in the next-gen. So I think you look at these 2 drivers, they're for sure the 2 favorites in my mind, but I might give the upper hand to Truex given his stats in the next-gen at Loudon. But again, you just want to take into account the drought he's on. But for me, personally, I feel like that gives me more of a reason to pick him, seeing as he did so well earlier in the year. I mentioned it. He had the second-place ranking in the standings for 7 straight weeks. He had the second-best average finish. He was just very consistent, and now it's just a matter of putting it back together again. And I really think it's going to come together at Loudon. And looking at his short tracks this year, he finished 7th at Phoenix. And if you'll think back to Richmond, he finished 4th with potentially a shot at the win after his teammate Hamlin jumped the restart. He also led the most laps in that race. So I think MTJ for sure, in my mind, is my personal favorite for the USA Today 301.
Absolutely. And for Martin Truex Jr., we didn't even mention his impending retirement after making the announcement. And you look at the remaining races on the schedule and how much he has dominated at New Hampshire in the next-gen car, which you covered well, it would be a shock to not see him looking at this date on the calendar as the one that presents the best opportunity to potentially go out there and get a win in 2024 before the gates close on this season. But in the same vein as Truex, Denny Hamlin's gone into his first slump of the season, and I'm using that term kind of loosely because it's only been 2 weeks, but Denny is plus 600 for the win. He's 10,800 in daily fantasy, which is the second most expensive driver, and he's coming off a 24th place finish at Iowa, day that just didn't go his way, and it's back-to-back finishes for him outside the top 20. But just, again, we talked about it last week, dominance on the short tracks this year with 450 laps led, as well as 3 wins. He's also a 3-time winner at Loudon, most recently not since 2017, but he does have the best average finish in the series at this track, 9.4, and that is over a whopping 30 starts. His finishes at Loudon in the next-gen era are 6th and 7th the last couple of years. So Denny Hamlin, again, same vein as Martin Truex Jr., with a slump right now, but he's been one of the best drivers all year, namely on the short tracks, and in his career, really, there hasn't been anyone better than Denny Hamlin at Loudon. Also, Kyle Larson. How do you leave Kyle Larson out of the favorites category? He's plus 600 as well. 10,000 in daily fantasy is good for 5th in the odds makers for DraftKings daily fantasy. And also coming off a down week last week. He was running really well. He mentioned that he was charging with 80 laps led in the race, had one of the best cars. And, a lot of people were saying it was the car to beat at that point in the race when he was taken out. Ended up finishing 34th. But this year for Kyle Larson, tied for most in wins, top 5s, poles, laps led, and second best in average finish. So he's been the most consistent driver in the sport all season long. And you look at his career at Loudon. He finished 14th there in 2022, but 3rd there in the last start. And he, like Denny Hamlin, has had really good success on the short tracks in 2024. He's got 4 top 5s, and that's including last week, which was not a top 5, of course, and he was running as a top 5 car. He's got 2 runner-ups, 4 top 5s, now over 350 laps led on the short tracks this year. He had a 14th at Phoenix and a 3rd at Richmond with over 140 laps led, which are probably the 2 most similar tracks to New Hampshire. So I'm going with, Kyle Larson and Denny Hamlin out of the favorites category because the 2 of them have easily been the cream of the crop on short tracks this year. And, I love your picks, too, of Christopher Bell and Martin Truex Jr. Like I said, definitely a who's who of Joe Gibbs Racing Toyotas plus Kyle Larson. I feel like that's pretty much what the favorites category looks like at any short track we go to, but it should especially be that way at New Hampshire.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, just want to restate, Joe Gibbs Racing is undefeated in the next gen at New Hampshire. They've led the most laps considerably. And you just look at their stats collectively throughout the year, I think JGR has been the cream of the crop on the short tracks.
Let's talk some sleepers here, Cole. And I'm going to go with, first of all, a driver that had a really good race last week. I'll kick this category off. I got to go with Chase Elliott, who finished 3rd, plus 1,400 for the race win, valued at 8th in daily fantasy, 9,200. And he's the new points leader after that 3rd place finish at Iowa. He's, we talked about some Joe Gibbs Racing drivers that are slumping. And Chase Elliott has very, very quietly been the hottest driver. He's got back-to-back top 5s, series best average finish now of 9.1. And listen, we talked about it probably a good 5 or 6 weeks ago. Chase Elliott is back in full effect. He's got 4 top 5s in 4 races with laps led on short tracks this year, including a 5th place at Richmond and 2nd place in his first next-gen start at Loudon with laps led, although a 12th last year. But you look at Chase Elliott, best results in the sport right now. He's got the top 5s and laps led on short tracks this year and has looked good at this track in this package. I think it's no mistake that Chase Elliott is a guy to keep your eye on. And my second sleeper, Cole, I'm going to be fully transparent with you. We're recording this podcast Friday morning. I woke up this morning and I had a dream that Bubba Wallace won this race at New Hampshire. I don't know why, but that was what I dreamt of last night. I don't remember the other details, but I dreamt that he won this race. And so for that reason, Bubba Wallace is my second sleeper this week. He is a really good value, too. Every once in a while, you get a sleeper that's a really good value, and that is the case with Bubba this week. He's plus 4,000 for the race win and 7,500 in daily fantasy, which is very, very cheap and a borderline lock. He's coming off a 17th place finish at Iowa. Really cold coming into this race, too. A 4-race top 10 drought. He is only plus 6 points above the cutoff line. You know he'd love some security in winning a race. But looking at his career at Loudon, he is one of only 4 drivers with top 10s in both of the next-gen starts at Loudon, with a 3rd and an 8th. And, we led off this episode by talking about how dominant the Toyotas and JGR was at New Hampshire in the next-gen car. Well, in that alliance is 2311 Racing, and Bubba Wallace has been arguably the most consistent driver behind Martin Truex Jr. at Loudon in the next-gen. So I love Bubba Wallace and Chase Elliott this week. Those are two of my favorite drivers, and they are such good values that we're going to call them sleepers this week.
Dreamin' of dubs. I love that. And also, coincidentally, Bubba Wallace is rocking the DraftKings paint scheme this week, fittingly enough. So that would be really cool to see him back in victory lane in that badass paint scheme. And you know what? You mentioned Bubba's consistency in the next gen at Loudon. Technically, he's been the second most consistent driver at Loudon in the next gen next to Martin Truex Jr. And the third driver on that list is actually going to be Brad Keselowski, who scored his 9th top 10 of the season at Iowa. And whenever I think of Loudon, I think of Brad Keselowski. And the reason for that being is he's always excelled on the flat, short tracks. Your Phoenixes, your Richmonds, your Loudons. It doesn't matter if it's Team Penske, RFK Racing. He's been one of the best drivers on those style of tracks. Case in point, 4th place at Phoenix this year, 8th place at Richmond as well. And then take into account his success at Loudon overall, it makes me very excited because BK is a 2-time winner at Loudon. As recently as 2020, he's also riding a 5-race top 10 streak, which is the longest active in the series, and that includes a 7th and 5th place finish in the next gen. And keep in mind, that's when he was not at his best for RFK Racing, so for him to have those stats in 2 down years, that's really impressive, really encouraging. Again, you factor into account the 4th place finish and 8th place finish at Phoenix and Richmond this year. I think BK is an awesome pick for this week. And again, just speaking again on the consistency aspect of things, mentioned he had the 3rd best average overall in the next gen at Loudon. He has the 2nd best average overall through 23 starts with a 9.8 average to Denny Hamlin's, I believe it was 9.4. So BK, by far and away, one of the best drivers in the modern era at Loudon. His values are plus $1,600 for the race win and $9,000 for DFS, which is the 9th most expensive. Now, keeping it in the Ford camp, I want to go with Brad's former teammate in Joey Logano, who is plus $800 for the race win and $9,800 for DFS, which is the 6th most expensive. So you're seeing Joey Logano take a big jump in value after Penske's prominence over the last 3 weeks. While his teammates Cindric and Blaney got the wins in those 2 of 3 weeks, Logano placed top 10 in a pair of those starts as well. And the only outlier being a race at Sonoma where he started from the pole and led 16 laps. So the speed's been there, and in that 3-week stretch, he's clawed his way up to -6 below the points cutoff with 9 races until the playoffs. So you look at the results on paper, and Joey has not had the most competitive season, but the speed's been there. Like we mentioned, the 3-week stretch he's been on currently, but he's got 3 poles. He got the All-Star race win, which, by the way, was at another flat short track in North Wilkesboro. And you look at his best shot at a points-paying win this season, that was a runner-up at Richmond, the track that's been touted as very similar to Loudon. And in regards to Loudon, that's where he finished last year to MTJ, 2nd place. Also want to keep in mind he has led laps in both next-gen starts. He's a 2-time winner at one of his home tracks, and he has a 56% top 10 rate in 25 starts. So Joey Logano, Brad Keselowski, 2 great blue oval picks as sleepers for the win in Loudon.
Yeah, I like this sleepers category quite a bit. I mean, Joey Logano's a guy I think of when we go to New Hampshire, obviously because it's his home track. He got his first win there. And like you said, I mean, you touched on it before when we were talking about the Splash and Go. You know, the Fords and Ryan Blaney and Austin Cindric have been 2 of the last 3 winners we've seen. And like you said, there definitely is more pressure on Joey. I think that it's, not a great value at plus 800. I think he's the 6th highest in odds, even in daily fantasy. So I tend to stay away from the value, but I really think Joey's got a great shot at this week's race. And same with Brad. Like you said all that there needs to be said. I don't want to harp on it anymore, but I feel really strongly about these sleepers this week and the favorites. I mean, feeling very confident 8 drivers into this episode. So let's talk some value picks as well, Cole. Why don't you kick this one off for us? I mean, I mentioned before, we've got a couple good values already that we've discussed. Namely, I like Bubba Wallace a lot. And there are certain drivers in this value picks category that are actually more expensive in daily fantasy than Bubba Wallace. But there's still values because I think you got to start this conversation with Josh Berry.
Yeah, definitely. And Josh Berry is $8,000 for this weekend. And I know I said it going in a few weeks ago that we were going to only do drivers that were true values in that $5,000, $6,000 range, low 7,000s, but I felt I can kind of, compensate for the Bubba Wallace $7,500 in the sleepers category. So, one thing I also want to do now, with the sleepers and the favorites, we usually kind of go through a overview of their season and their current stretch, kind of giving pros and cons. But I think with the value picks, you want to know why we're giving you these value picks. So I'm going to kick this off with, again, Josh Berry, who had a phenomenal top 10 showing at Iowa and led over 30 laps late in the running. I thought he had a great shot at this win, honestly. And this team has really picked up the pace as of late. They've had speed all season. Now they're kind of putting it together. That was his third top 10 of the season, and he has all three of those top 10s over the last 5 races. So Rodney Childers, Josh Berry, that SHR crew, I know they're going away at the end of the season, but they have got things tuned up right now. And the only outliers in that 5-race stretch were due to a tire and mechanical failure. So without those, we could be talking about top 15s, some more top 10s. So I love what I've seen from this team. And they've also been about a top 20 car all season. That's made evident by his 20.1 average finish overall. And he's only getting better. So I think you factor in what they've looked like over these last 5 races, on top of the fact that Josh Berry is a short track ace. It's a no-brainer to have him in your lineup. And spoiler alert, going into this DFS lineup construction, he was the first driver I went to when building our lineup. So with that in mind, he has 3 top 15s on short tracks this year, including that 7th place finish at Iowa. Laps led in 3 starts, and he finished 11th at Richmond, which again is a like track to Loudon. So I love Josh Berry this weekend, as well as his teammate Chase Briscoe, who is $7,200. The reason I like Chase Briscoe this week is because he finished 10th and 15th in the next gen at Loudon, which is one of the more consistent drivers in that regard. And he's also been one of the more consistent drivers all season from that Ford stable. I will say, though, he has not finished inside the top 10 in the last 4 races. So, again, there's a little concern there. But just speaking on the positives, I like what we've seen from Chase Briscoe in the next gen at Loudon. And he has, again, even with the little rough stretch, he's been one of the more faster cars from that organization. So, love both those drivers. I got 2 Fords. I got 2 Chevys lined up for you here, Steven.
Yeah, I really like the idea of picking a driver that's hot in Daniel Suarez, because he's coming off that top 10 last week at Iowa. And for Daniel Suarez, it's a guy that I just feel like he rides the momentum so well. When he has a good race, he backs it up with another good race. Great value for someone that's in good equipment, because he's valued at only $6,900 in DFS this week. The numbers don't light up the stat sheet at New Hampshire in the next gen. He's got a 9th and a 16th, which, all things considered, for Daniel Suarez really is not bad. And a guy, again, I just think rides the momentum wave, and I look at that value at $6,900 for someone that's got speed and showed it as recently as last week at a similar layout track in Iowa to what we're going to this week in New Hampshire. And I like the idea of Daniel Suarez being a value this week, potentially. There might be other values that are more affordable that may be a little more warranted, but Daniel Suarez is definitely on my radar. Another one of those ITs that is actually the cheapest of our values this week is a guy that's running a top 20 car all year, and that's Carson Hocevar, who's been really, really impressive this year, in my opinion. A 20.1 average finish for a guy that had extremely limited experience in the upper levels of NASCAR entering this year. And he's challenging for top 15s and top 10s almost every week. And more times than not, those weeks happen to be on the 1-mile ovals, like 14th at Iowa last week, 15th at Phoenix the week earlier in the season. So for Carson Hocevar, you're not looking for a top 10. You might even luck into one, however. But he's had a really consistent season for a young guy that has shown an ability to run well at these kinds of tracks. So $6,300, if you're looking for a cheap driver to fill out your lineup, Carson Hocevar is a guy that I feel like you can feel pretty damn good about. So that wraps up the value picks with Chase Briscoe, Josh Berry, Daniel Suarez, and Carson Hocevar. Cole, let's get this down to a field of 12 drivers. We just did 4 favorites, 4 sleepers, 4 values. Give me your favorite from each category.
For my favorite, I'm going to go with MTJ. For my sleeper, it's going to be Brad Keselowski. And then I'm going to go with the Berry Man, Josh Berry, for my value pick this week.
All good stuff. I'll take Denny Hamlin. I just like the Toyotas a lot out of my favorites. I will take Bubba Wallace, another Toyota from the sleepers. And I will go with Carson Hocevar as my favorite value just because can't beat that price. But we've had really good success this year too, Cole. As I'll just recap that real quick. There's Denny Hamlin, Martin Truex Jr., Brad Keselowski, Bubba Wallace, Josh Berry, and Carson Hocevar. But on to our next segment. We have had really good success this year with big money bets at the short tracks. And looking at this field at New Hampshire, we've talked about some drivers that we've enlisted a lot of confidence in. And I think there's definitely some value to be had this week with some big money bets. Give me what you're looking at this week.
Let's go. Pumped for the big money bets this weekend. I have 3 lined up here that I'm a huge fan of. Going to kick it off with the top 5 prop here for Brad Keselowski, who has won top 5 already in the next gen at Loudon, as well as that 7th place finish. And we also mentioned him as being one of the most consistent drivers in the next gen here, along with Bubba Wallace, who has a 3rd and 8th place finish. Bubba Wallace to finish top 10 is plus 140. That is an excellent value, one that I'm a huge fan of for someone who's done that twice already in the next gen. And then my last one I have here is Josh Berry to finish top 10 at plus 120. I mean, he's a short track ace. All three of his top 10s in the Cup Series this year have come in the last 5 weeks. So to round that up, you have 2 drivers in Keselowski and Bubba Wallace who are top 3 in consistency in terms of average finish at Loudon in the next gen. BK is also one of the best all-time at Loudon. Just spoke on Josh Berry. I think all 3 of these prop bets for big money bets are home runs. Pun fully intended with Brad Keselowski's Red Sox number 6 this weekend.
I love those. I will definitely echo both of those picks for you. I think that certainly for top 10s, that is where the value is to be had. But you look at really any of the other drivers we mentioned as far as top 5 bets go, you could definitely throw a flyer out there on a guy that's plus money like Joey Logano at plus 110. I wouldn't call that a big money bet. The same can be said for Chase Elliott, who's at plus 140 for a top 5. I think I said top 10 before, but I meant to say top 5. Top 5 for Chase Elliott, plus 140. Brad Keselowski, plus 155 for a top 5. Those are 2 guys we mentioned as sleepers that have a really good shot at winning the race. So on top of the 3 that you just mentioned, and including the Brad top 5, I would just probably add Chase Elliott and Joey Logano perhaps for top 5s because I like those a lot for over even money. You could obviously go for one of the guys that's a Joe Gibbs Toyota like Bell, Truex, or Hamlin, but they're all minus 120 or longer odds to end up being in the top 5. So there's just not a ton of value there. But I do like any of those first 8 drivers we mentioned from the favorites or sleepers. Pick your poison for a top 5 or a top 10 prop bet, and I feel pretty good about that. So we call them big money bets because you can put a realistically a larger amount of units on there. If you usually go with like $5 or $10 for a race winner, you can throw $30, $40, $50 on a big money bet for a top 5, top 10 prop and feel pretty good about it. And we cashed out with those last week. We pretty much cash out with those every week. It's a nice insurance policy, I would say. It is a big money bet. But let's also talk here, Cole, about the head-to-head driver matchups because there is definitely some intrigue in here this week and some that you might consider. So like talking about how confident we feel out of the 12 drivers we just mentioned, I'm going to give you these head-to-head matchups and let me know what direction you want to take it. So you got Blaney versus Brad Keselowski. You got Christopher Bell versus Martin Truex Jr., Denny Hamlin versus Chase Elliott, Stenhouse versus Berry, and then Todd Gilliland versus Daniel Suarez.
I'm actually very pumped up for this week for the head-to-head bets because I feel like more often than not, we're like, you start away from these. There's not a whole lot of value here. They're split 50-50 matchups. But you know what? I see 3 matchups here that I'm very confident in. And I think if you parlay the 3 I'm looking at, and even just one alone in itself is a big money bet. I love Brad over Blaney, which is a plus 135 odds. That in itself is a big money bet in my opinion. I'll let you know in a second as to why I feel this way. And then the 2 of Berry over Stenhouse for minus 275 and Suarez over Gilliland minus 155 are also 2 that I like a lot. And those are heavy favorites, but if you parlay those with the Brad Keselowski over Brian Blaney, it equates to plus 427 odds. And if you throw $10 on that, you're walking away with $52.72 as a potential payout. So I love the idea of parlaying those three matchups, and for these reasons. So I know Ryan Blaney won last week at Iowa. However, in his career at Loudon, he has not finished better than fourth. That was back in 2019. He only has 4 top 10s in his career in 11 starts. And if you look at all three of these drivers that I picked over one another, so Stenhouse, Gilliland, and Blaney, all three drivers have not finished above 18th in the next-gen car at Loudon. That is a huge, huge stat for me. I think Berry over Stenhouse is an easy one. There's a reason why that one's minus 275. He is a heavy, heavy favorite. Suarez over Gilliland, again, minus 155. Heavy favorite, coming off a top 10 finish. I think Todd, he was someone who I was thinking about for a value pick for this episode, but just looking at his stats overall on the short tracks this season and at Loudon, didn't make sense to include him. So factoring in Suarez's success at Loudon and coming off the top 10 last week at Iowa, it's kind of a no-brainer. And again, I just mentioned Blaney's stats, no finish above 18th in the next gen at Loudon, only 4 top 10s and 11 starts. And given Brad's success, 5 straight top 10s, 7th and 5th in the next gen, the plus 135 makes a whole lot of sense. So I'm a big fan of those three matchups. The Bell versus Truex is a 50-50. Hamlin versus Elliott's 50-50. So there is a lot of value to be had with those three matchups, in my opinion.
So we're having a pretty good show here because there's money to be made on the match bets, there's money to be made on the prop bets, and on the race winner bets. So we're on a good roll here. Let's try to make this all 4 of our categories here because we have some unfinished business. We're going to each recommend a daily fantasy lineup to you, the viewers. And sometimes it's the same. Sometimes we kind of collaborate on one. But there's definitely this week, I feel like at a lot of the short tracks, really, it's not quite as easy to construct a well-rounded lineup because of how predictable they've been in recent history. But as I look at my DFS lineup this week, Cole, I went with quite a few aces, meaning 3, paired with 3 drivers that are more so value picks. And I like the idea of leading off my lineup with the ace of aces, the guy that's been by far the best at this track in the next-gen car, in Martin Truex Jr., 10,500. And then I went with my next most expensive driver as Joey Logano at 9,800. I look at him as kind of at the bottom of tier number 1. Along with my next driver, Chase Elliott, I chose at 9,200. I think you've got 3 drivers there that have a legitimate chance to win this race. And so obviously when you're picking 3 drivers that expensive, had to compensate for it on the back end. My 4th most expensive driver was Bubba Wallace. We talked about a borderline lock value at 7,500 this week. And then I went with a driver we didn't discuss in Ryan Preece as my 5th driver. He is 6,600, but another guy that just throughout his career has done very well on the short tracks. This is his home track. We've seen him perform well at Loudon before. I know we didn't talk about him, but I feel good, in a gut feeling sense about Ryan Preece this week at 6,600. And then rounding out that lineup with Carson Hocevar, who is a top 20 driver this year and better than that on the short track. So I feel pretty solidly about my lineup for daily fantasy. How about yourself?
I feel great about mine as well. I mean, I usually go through, make a few different variations to give people some options and, play around with things, but I went with one lineup and just pretty much locked it in because I love the way this thing turned out. Like you, I locked in MTJ as my favorite at 10,500 for obvious reasons. From there, I sacrificed Joey Logano for Brad Keselowski. I just love his stats at this track. In his career, recently, I think the 5-race top 10 streak is too good to ignore. Got the 5th place and 7th place finish in the next gen. And again, that was when he was not at his best. So I think that this team is going to have a really strong run. After that, my most expensive driver is actually Josh Berry, who I mentioned he's the guy I actually built my lineup around at $8,000. Again, just speaking on the role this team has been on, his prominence on the short tracks, it makes a lot of sense to have him in your lineup. And then from there, I had a driver that we did not mention in Kyle Busch at $7,700. And Kyle Busch is an interesting one because he is a winner at Loudon. He's won here twice before, most recently in 2017, but he has not finished inside the top 10 since 2019. But I think the interesting thing here is that Kyle Busch has had obviously a very troubling season, results-wise, but he has had speed. Like, I know he's not finished inside the top 10 going on 5 weeks now, or 5 races, but he's had top 10 speed. He had it at Sonoma. He got bullied out of the top 10 by Ross Chastain. Top 15 at Charlotte in a rain-shortened race. And then he had 2 races in Gateway and Iowa where he had a water pump failure and a crash. So I think there's obviously going to be some volatility with Kyle Busch, just seeing as how his season's going, which is weird to say. But I think you just look at his stats historically and just how this team has done this season. I mean, again, I know the results aren't there, but the speed is, and it's got to equal out at some point. And you're looking at somebody who's fighting for a playoff spot and who people have pegged as someone who could potentially miss out. Kyle Busch is someone who I think is going to turn it on here and have a really strong showing in Loudon. And then from there, I had Daniel Suarez at $6,900. We mentioned how he has a pretty solid showing here in his career at Loudon. Got a few top 10s, including in the next-gen car, plus a 16th place finish, which is pretty respectable. And again, I just like his value a lot as a Trackhouse racing car and coming off that top 10 finish at Iowa. So he's actually my least expensive driver in this lineup at $6,900. And I think having Suarez and that Trackhouse equipment as your your anchor for the lineup's pretty good strategy for this weekend. And again, I feel great about this lineup.
Yeah, you got some good options there. I think between your lineup and your lineup, and you make really good points in favor of Kyle Busch as well. So I think, we've kind of been bridging on it the entire episode. I feel pretty good about all of this. Like, I feel good about the race winner picks. I feel good about the props, the top 5s, top 10s. Feel good about the head-to-heads and the daily fantasy. So this is one of those rare weeks where it's like an equinox, where everything is lining up. Like, you could win money in every single different type of bet as we go to New Hampshire this week. And again, the numbers don't lie. We've had such great success in predicting the short tracks this year and, really the last few years of this podcast. So let's take it to the bank, Cole. Let's talk race winner picks here because I feel really good about all of that. And it's time to put our money where our mouth is. And as we kind of recap where we were at last week, I chose Denny Hamlin for the win. Probably my worst race winner pick of the season. Not for lack of trying, because, how could Denny Hamlin ever be a bad pick? But he did not have a good race at Iowa. So and you pick Christopher Bell. And as we dive into things here, you've got first pick, and I think I know which direction you're going.
Yeah, sweet. Definitely going to go with MTJ as my winner this week. I honestly was kind of leaning towards Brad Keselowski. In case you couldn't tell, I feel really good about him this weekend, but I think I would be foolish to not pick MTJ with those numbers. Or 400 laps led in the next gen, got the win here last year. He needs a good finish here to get his season back on track. I think MTJ gets back in victory lane this weekend after announcing his retirement from full-time racing last week.
Yeah, that would have definitely been my pick if you hadn't gone first. By the way, I failed to mention, too, I did pick Ricky Stenhouse Jr. as my sleeper last week, and he was a top 5 finish. So keep an eye on the sleepers this week, too. Behind Truex, I got to be honest, there's not one driver that's calling my name. Like, I feel good about 5 different guys. You mentioned one in Brad. I like Denny a lot. I like Larson. I like Christopher Bell. And then there's guys in maybe next tier like Chase Elliott and Joey Logano I also feel good about. But I think this is going to be one of those weeks where I just got to go with my gut, and I'm going to go with Brad Keselowski. I just can't deny that success he's had here over his entire career and even during the next-gen era, and he's at his best with this RFK team right now. And no surprise, for my sleeper, I got to go with Bubba Wallace. Like I said, had a dream he won the race last night. He's at plus 4,000 for the win. That's just outside the top 15 in odds. So give me Bubba and give me Brad as my sleeper and my winner this week.
Those are 2 excellent picks. I love Bubba Wallace a lot this weekend as well. I'll go with Carson Hocevar. I think he made some really good points about him. He's been, like you said, top 20 car all season long. Got the top 15 at Phoenix, and he's just a very rock-steady driver all season long. Again, challenging for top 15s, finishing top 20. I think he gets top 15 this weekend. Love
it. And I feel pretty good about those picks. There's a lot of money to be had this week, Cole. So I hope, if you're listening, I hope you're telling us, because this was an episode that the both of us honestly feel really good about entering the weekend. But we've got some unfinished business. Every once in a while, we like to discuss kind of our favorite memories from Loudon, which in years past hasn't been the most compelling track. Obviously, it's a 1 mile oval. You don't tend to see the most passing, the most excitement on these tracks. But favorite memories from Loudon, Cole, it's a pretty easy one for me. I mean, I remember back to really around the peak of my NASCAR fandom, 2010, Jimmy Johnson en route to winning his 5th straight championship, got bumped out of the lead by Kurt Busch with less than 10 laps to go in the chase race at Loudon. And Jimmy, who's known for not being an aggressive driver and known for not being one to lay the bumper, gave Kurt Busch a taste of his own medicine and bumped him out of the lead with 2 laps to go in that race at New Hampshire. And I remember after that race, it was one of the best burnouts I remember Jimmy ever having in 2010. And that was, of course, en route to winning the 5th straight championship. So for me, it's an easy answer. Jimmy always ran well here. I always liked coming here. And that's definitely the memory that sticks out for me.
That's a good one. For me, mine's a bit obscure. So it's back in 2021. This was the race that was called for darkness, actually, that Eric Almirola won his final Cup Series race in 2021. This was memorable for me because I remember I was flying back from our family trip to New York, and I got to watch the entire race actually on the plane, which I was very stoked about. Killed a lot of time, didn't get to miss anything, and it was a pretty solid race in general, too. I mean, I felt bad for Christopher Bell because he clearly had the best car, and had the race gone another lap or two longer, he would have definitely run down Almirola. But nonetheless, it was a really good race competitively. It was cool seeing Almirola's, I guess, potentially final win in the Cup Series. And it was also just interesting to see that race called for darkness, because I hadn't seen that in quite some time. And just having that personal experience of being able to watch on the plane was pretty fun.
I remember that. I actually wasn't able to watch on the plane, but I was kind of like tracking it as religiously as I could. But I remember thinking how weird it was that it was called for darkness. That's another one that definitely sticks out. Well, this is going to be the USA Today 301. It's going to be Sunday at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time. On a personal note, too, I mean, I've gotten pretty familiar with the Loudon area, working over here for the Somerset Patriots. We've had quite a few road trips to Manchester, New Hampshire, which is just south of Loudon. Met a lot of people that have worked at Loudon, and obviously I can't make it to the race because it's in the baseball season, and I'm always traveling. I'll actually be in a different city, Richmond, Virginia, that's host both a AA baseball team and a NASCAR track. But I love the area up there. I think it would be really cool to get out to Loudon at some point, and I know you would love to get back out there as well. But it's going to be a cool race. We'll see how it goes. I think there's a lot of money to be made this week at the USA Today 301, which again will take place on Sunday. Coming to you a little bit later in the week this week, so thanks for bearing with us, and we hope you're able to tune in this week and tell us. This has been a really great and insightful episode. Your most important NASCAR betting stop of the day, the money stop, and we will drop the jack just as any good pit stop and money stop does, and we will leave you at that. Thanks so much to everyone for tuning in. Follow us on social media for all the latest in developing storylines throughout the weekend. That'll be important to follow at @the_money_stop. You can follow Cole's personal account, my personal account, and won't have to search very far on the Money Stop account to find our personal accounts. But I think, Cole, this will be a fun race. I feel like there was, you touched on it at the very beginning. This race at Iowa was probably the best, one of the best for sure, short track races in the next-gen era, and that leaves a cause for optimism, I feel, entering this week at New Hampshire. I know it's a track that we've been to quite a bit, but it shows it can be done, that with a race like we saw at Iowa last week, and I think that's definitely where my head's going to be at this week.
Yeah, for sure. I think historically it hasn't been the most compelling stuff on track, but we have seen some better races in recent memory. And I don't know. I don't think they're bringing a new tire here. I think that the biggest difference maker last week was the tire and how much it obviously wore down and the fall off and whatnot. So hopefully it's the same thing. But obviously a lot of optimism coming out of Iowa. We've had some pretty good races this year on the short tracks. I mean, I like what I saw at Phoenix. I think Richmond was also a pretty solid race. Again, you mentioned Iowa, mentioned Bristol. So short tracks are on the come up, I feel like. So yeah, I feel good about this weekend. I feel even better about our analysis. So I mean, if you're not pumped up to watch pumped up to watch Loudon, given the history of the track, the nature of the track, at least watch for your bets, because this was an incredible episode, and I would be shocked if you didn't win something if you took our advice.
Very true. So this is going to be a good one. Catch it, the USA Today 301 at 2:30 Eastern Time on Sunday. Thanks again for everyone for tuning in. For Cole, I'm Steven. We'll drop the jack here on the Money Stop, and we'll see you next week.